Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
A couple months ago, Antonia and I got a subscription to HBO Now. They released a digital online version of watching HBO, basically. And you can subscribe to this, at least here in the United States, and watch all the different HBO shows. And we did it primarily to watch John Oliver's Last Week Tonight. We really love that show. And we started discovering some HBO programming. We've been watching The Wire recently, about the drug trade in Baltimore City, and a show from the 2000s. And we watched the movie last night. It was an HBO movie last night called Going Clear, which is about the Church of Scientology and some of the people who have left the church and are now basically talking about their experience of coming out of that church experience, that religious experience. It's a fascinating movie. If you have HBO or you'd like to subscribe, this is not a pitch for HBO, but it's probably worth the subscription for just some of the shows I've already mentioned and watching that movie, Going Clear, because I think it's a powerful movie and it really illustrates a lot of the stuff we talk about here on Personality Hacker.
There was a moment in that movie that actually had me crying, because when you separate, or when you basically come out about your experience, at least with Scientology. Now, of course, you're only hearing one side of the story. It's a pretty compelling side of a story, but you're still only hearing one side of a story. But they have an arrangement where if you at all mar the reputation of Scientology, or if you even go, basically against the teaching, and you've been very well entrenched, up to that point, they have a arrangement that they call disconnecting. And disconnecting is very familiar to me because in the religion that I grew up in, I was disfellowshipped, and it sounded very similar. And so disfellowshipping, disconnecting, the Amish call it shunning, right? This is an arrangement that if you leave the paradigm, or if you no longer ascribe to the lifestyle that you previously committed yourself to, then you don't get to be around anybody you love anymore. That's part of the arrangement. The arrangement is that you will be shunned or removed from the lives of all these people that, maybe they're your family members. The reason why I was moved to tears is the woman who was disconnected, she was disconnected from her daughter, her adult daughter, who said, "I'm sorry, I can't connect with you anymore. I can't talk to you anymore." And that very much mirrored my experience with my family and all the people in my life that I loved before all of my friends. And I had a very similar experience where it was because of my choices to leave and, my resulting lifestyle, then I was no longer qualified to have a relationship with any of these people that I had loved so much, who had been my complete support system. And so she was talking about her experience. And I mean, having it happen to you with your parents is hard enough, but I can't even imagine my child no longer connecting with me or communicating with me because I've chosen a different way of thinking. And I've had a lot of healing work done around this. It created some trauma for me a few years ago, or actually it's been quite a few years now that it happened, and I had a lot of trauma around it, and I did a lot of healing. But of course, it was a very fascinating topic to me while I was healing, right? I was trying to figure out what is going on here. What is happening when you are removed from a paradigm, right? A tribe or society or culture around a paradigm. What exactly is happening? And at that time, I did a lot of study around the concept of memes. Memes being thought viruses, right? Like these ideas that everybody seems to have at the same time. They're basically the root of all fads. They're the root of religions. They're the root of any time, patriotism. Anytime we think anything collectively, right? As a collective unconscious, that's a meme. And there's a lot of great material written about memes. Idea Virus, the book Idea Virus is a great one. There's a lot of different really great material around this concept of memes and how they work in the collective unconscious. Well, one thing that I noticed about paradigms, they don't even have to be religions necessarily, but they just have to be a paradigm, right? A belief system or like a worldview that will go to that extent. I started calling them, just sort of casually, I started calling them bully memes, right? They're bullies. If you don't do what that person, if you don't do what the bully tells you to do, they're going to beat you up, or they're going to ostracize you, or they're going to, they're just basically going to make your life a living hell. And what's fascinating about this is that we always think of bullies as either an individual, right? Like the big kid in the school, courtyard, or we think of it as a mob mentality, sort of a collective bullying with like torches and pitchforks. But what I find fascinating is this concept of memes being bullies, right? Like the meme itself has woven into it this concept of bullying, right? It's a part of the mimetic structure, because with disconnecting or disfellowshipping or shunning or anything else that you can call it, it's essentially it's an institutionalized punishment. So it's not even that the people who are, charged with implementing the shunning, it's not that they're happy about it, right? Like nobody likes this.
Yeah.
Even the people who are like, the people who are implementing it, they hate it, right? They can't help but project it onto the person that's being shunned, right? Like, well, you did something bad and that's why I have to do this to you, because nobody feels good about it. But why would a meme do that? Why would there be institutionalized shunning as part of a belief system? And it's because memes want to live just like everything else, right? A meme is just like anything else. It wants to live. And one of the best ways to continue living is to take an aggressive approach, right? Like how does anything live? Well, it spreads, it procreates, it becomes the big man on campus, it tries to get the top of the food chain, right? Like that's how basically anything survives. And memes are no different. So what's so fascinating about this concept is that there are memes, there are paradigms, there are belief systems that woven in require the believer to become something that they would not normally become, and that is a bully.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is when we're talking about this, mostly we are talking about behavior to some degree, but we're talking a lot about thoughts and how we're thinking as people. And, if you're in a religion, if you're in a country and you're patriotic, if you're in a corporate culture, if you're on a sports team or you love a sports team, and, you start to dissent from a line of thinking, not even in behavior, but just the thinking alone is a threat to other people that are bought into this. I think so I grew up in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are my team, right? That's the team I grew up supporting or being a fan of in football, American football here in the United States. And if you ever come to Pittsburgh, you will definitely know you're in Pittsburgh because there's Steeler stuff everywhere. And it's definitely a meme that has taken over an entire region of the country I live in, right around the Pittsburgh region, because people identify with this, their minds are aligned with it. And if you go to a football game and someone is from a different team, and even if they're not behaving anyway, even if they're not like dressed obscenely for another team, even if they're not like yelling or ranting and raving, but they just like clap or offer support for the other team, they're at some point, sometimes their lives are at risk because of how strong the meme is in supporting a football team. That's how weird this is, right? Like think about American football and how much power it has over people. Like in the streets of Denver or Oakland, California, if their football teams lose, they like flip cars over and light stuff on fire. This is like powerful stuff. I'm not even talking about religion or politics. I'm talking about American football, right? So just imagine now taking that same idea from football, which is something I think most people would not like put their lives on the line for. Most people, unless you're in Oakland or Denver, most people aren't going to like go to the guillotine and die for their belief in a football team. And now translate that to something that's like religious or political structured. And the mindset that a lot of these memes require us as people to have to be a part of them. And when we're not, it's like an organism rejecting something that's bad for it. Imagine the meme is like an organism, like your body. And if you have an illness or some type of a rogue element like cancer or something else, your body's going to try to attack that and rid it out of itself, like remove that element as a danger. And I think what we're talking about here, when you talk about bullies, it's also, bully sounds like an aggressive, offensive strategy, as to most a high degree. I think we're also talking about a defensive strategy where it's a protection element. My body's a bully to the diseases it catches because it doesn't want to die. But it's more defensive in that regard as well. So I think you have an offensive where you're attacking like maybe other people's positions and things from a meme standpoint, but you're also in a defensive mode from an internal standpoint. And it's all ideas. It's the structures of our minds is what we believe. And it's so weird how we as humans allow this to control how we behave and how things show up in our lives so powerfully.
Especially when it encourages us to act in ways that are contrary to our character. I don't think most people who are fans of the Oakland Raiders see themselves as, you know, basic loiter. No, what's the word? Not loiterers. The ones
Vandals?
Looters.
Looters.
Yeah, vandals, or, you know, they're not really people who see themselves as like car flippers and somebody's gonna light stuff on fire, right? Like they probably don't see themselves that way, and yet pushed. Well, they would feel that they were pushed to it. You know, if there's a major riot happening around this American football team, it encourages them into behaviors that go contrary to their like day-to-day nature. And I see the same thing as religions that encourage, or even institutions. I don't even think it's just religions. Institutions that encourage a variation of shunning. Like I said earlier, nobody likes doing that. And so it encourages behavior that goes contrary to your character, and even sometimes your very like your very ancient programming, which is to hold your family close to you. And this idea of shunning them now goes very, very, very much against your nature in that. And yet the meme will encourage you to go towards those behaviors.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I like to do is we can talk about religion, but I think it's good to use examples outside of that, because it's maybe easy to pick on religions that do this. If you think about in the 1950s and 60s, during the McCarthy era here in the United States, you have basically witch hunts on Hollywood movie stars and writers to say they were called into Washington. A bunch of people would testify and say, this person's a communist and they're promoting communist propaganda. And they were literally blacklisted, and they were not allowed to work in the industry in Hollywood. They weren't allowed to work in the movie industry. They weren't allowed to get acting jobs, screenwriting jobs, whatever it was. They were blacklisted literally from being able to participate, or you're never going to work a day again in this town type, message. And it was because they were a threat to a meme that was existing in the United States at that time. And not only a threat to the meme, but they were a threat with a voice. They were actors, writers, communicators, filmmakers. These are people who threaten memes like crazy because they can communicate. They have megaphones. They can communicate something so strongly and so quickly that you have to eradicate that immediately. So I think it's easy to maybe look at religions around this, but I think it happens all the time in any other structure, a social meme-like structure like this.
Oh, totally. What was that documentary? It was on Netflix. There was a documentary around the MacArthur period, and it focused on one of the screenwriters who, his life just got turned upside down, and he ended up having to go to Mexico, and none of his friends would talk to him anymore, and
he was shunned from Hollywood, basically.
He was totally shunned, and didn't he say something to the effect of they were holding him during the McCarthy trials? They were holding him in contempt of court, and he goes, that was a pretty appropriate thing to do because I had a lot of contempt for that court. And so, oh gosh, I wish I could remember that Netflix. If you've seen it, please let it remind us what it is in the comments underneath this podcast. But it was just a great, great documentary. And these are such, we watch these things and we go, oh my gosh, how could anybody ever do that? And yet the reason why I think it's such a fascinating topic is we do this a lot. Right? We get this sense. We just did a podcast on gurus, the very last podcast we did on gurus that you might have outgrown, right? You might have gone past what the guru can teach you. And we were listening to, on the Tim Ferriss podcast, he was interviewing, what was her name?
Tara.
Yes, Tara something. She wrote a book called, man, my memory is terrible.
I know,
today.
we need to write all this stuff down before we start recording so we can have all this. We'll have to put it in the podcast notes.
We'll put it in the podcast notes. It's just kind of, all this conversation is coming up organically, so I don't have all my notes and, ducks in a row. But she wrote a book called Radical Acceptance. And she was mentioning that she had she was in this ashram community, and it was basically like a community around meditation and yoga. And they had a guru, and she had a not a great situation. She ended up during a meditation or a yogic experience. It was very hot. I don't know if I caught a little bit of this. It almost sounded like it might have been like a Bikram yoga situation, or maybe I'm just completely, inferring that that's the kind of situation it was. But it was very hot, and she ended up having a miscarriage. And she let the guru know, the person who was leading the ashram community, know that the conditions might be, and maybe it wasn't even yoga, maybe it was just a meditation, it was just very warm or hot. And she was letting him know that these conditions might not be good for women who are pregnant. And the guru ended up, or the spiritual leader of the ashram community ended up telling her that she lost the baby because of there was something wrong with her. It was her ego had her lose the baby. It wasn't the actual physical conditions. And not only did he say that to her, but he called her out in front of the entire community when he did this. And she said that she went away and she had of course, she was devastated, right? Because this was her community. She was totally devastated, and she wept and she tried to make sense of it. And then she eventually said that she came to a moment when she realized that she could either go back and say, yes, this was a fault of mine, it was my ego, and hand that over to the spiritual leader, or she could trust her own wisdom. She could trust herself, which she decided to do. And she decided to leave the community. And she went on, to go impact the world in great ways by writing books and becoming a leader, right? Like to help people with meditation and really understand themselves and understand the ego. Tara Brach. That is her name. Her name is Tara Brach. And so what's so fascinating, I thought, about her story that I heard in the Tim Ferriss podcast was that she allowed herself to go away from the bully meme because she trusted her own wisdom. The bully meme may have only actually come from one person. That might have not been woven into the paradigm or the meme, but the community, the ashram community, handed themselves over to to the spiritual leader. And that was the person who set the tone. So sometimes a single ego can set the tone and create a bully situation. Regardless, it was a situation in which she realized that she was handing over a lot of personal power to this situation, to the community and to this idea around, losing her child in this terrible way. And she decided to trust her own inner wisdom. And I think that was so great in comparison to these other situations that we talk about where, people end up becoming exiled from their communities. They're usually actually the ones that trust their wisdom. The people who become exiled or maybe exile themselves, they're generally the ones who are trusting their inner wisdom. The contrast is not to them. The contrast is the people who are doing the exiling. They're going against their true nature and they're not trusting their inner wisdom because their inner wisdom is kicking and screaming against the situation as a general rule. They don't want to exile their loved ones. They don't want to not have a relationship with the people that they love, right? I would say that even like the people in the situation of like the American football fans, and I mean the rest of the world calls football, or calls what we call soccer, they calls football, and they're just as aggressive all over the planet. Oh, yeah. Right? Like this is not just something that American football fans.
I was in Brazil during the World Cup. It was crazy down there.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's an inner wisdom that all of these people have too, that is completely taken over by the fanaticism that comes along with loving a football team, regardless of if you're in America or not, or the fanaticism that can come with patriotism or a fear that your government will do something horrible to you if you don't play along, like with the McCarthy time period. And right before that was the Nazi time period in Germany. I mean, there's plenty of examples of people handing their inner wisdom over to a paradigm. And the people who are the exiles are generally the ones who are listening to their inner wisdom. And they're usually the ones who have a big impact on others because they go, you know what, you don't have to hand this power over to anybody else. You can actually let go. You can let go of that paradigm. You can let go of that, that bully meme.
Oh, this has been a powerful thing for me in my life. And in fact, I'd recommend you go listen to that podcast, the Tim Ferriss podcast with Tara, because it is a really powerful podcast, especially for me. I've, in my life, in moving forward, one of the things that I've always done is not trusted myself, not trusted that I had the answers for things. And I was always in a perpetual student role. Like, I got to learn more. I got to study more. I got to think about this more. I need to find more experts about this. Well, if everybody disagrees with me, that must not be right. Who am I to say this is the right course of action? Who am I to say that this is what should go? Man, all these people are dissenting from what I think. That must be the universe or the world telling me that I'm off the wrong track. And so I would align myself with other people's thinking. And in recent years, the more and more I step into trusting my own inner wisdom, trusting the things that come from my heart and my mind, after some experience, I think if you're young, it's wise to look to other people for advice and help and some frameworks and things. But especially when you've had some experience, especially when you've gone through the world and you've gone through some rough times and some bumps and bruises, you can say, you know what, I'm going to make a decision here to trust my inner wisdom. I'm going to make a decision to say, maybe this meme isn't the best meme for me. Maybe I would be better served to move beyond this. And that can be terrifying, especially if everybody around you is looking at you going, you're crazy, or you're stupid, or you're being childish, or you're being rebellious, or whatever story the people around you may have. It can feel like you're going against the grain to the degree where, you know, there's an internal biology here that says don't go against the tribe because you could literally die out in the cold by yourself. And so everything in you is like, I got to align myself with the people around me. And yet, I think what you said is really powerful, this idea that when you realize that you can trust yourself to move beyond the memes that you're at place in your life right now, and you get to the other side and you're like, oh, that wasn't so bad. And you look over and you start seeing the meme from the outside. Sometimes you almost say, man, how did I stay thinking this way so long? Again, whatever sports team, religion, political system, culture at work, whatever that might be, you almost look at it and go, wow, how did I think this was so important for so long? And now that I'm out of it, I'm seeing such a different perspective. It's such an eye-opening experience. And I know that's been really powerful for me in my life. So, you know, I think that's something that I would recommend if you're on the cusp. If you're listening, you're on the cusp of trusting yourself. I think there's a balance here to say, be cautious, always look for people's help. And this is probably my inner student still talking, right? I still deal with this. And yet I say, you probably err on the side of trusting yourself more than not. I think you'll probably be better served to do that, because you can always fall back into society, that all these systems and memes that are set up, you can go, oh, I was wrong, and just come right back to it. But that oomph of pushing yourself forward, it's such a difficult thing that sometimes just do it, even if you don't think you're ready, even if you think you got to study more or learn from other people more. I think it's a good thing just to move yourself into that.
Just like everything, this whole idea of why people stay in those kinds of situations versus, you know, the allowing a situation like a shunning situation to work or happen. It's a system, and you can't just blame the meme, right? The bully meme is one big node in the system. There's other nodes in the system that have the experience of being shunned or disconnected or disfellowshipped or whatever you want to call it. There are other components in that. And one of them is found in our understanding of, human development in the Graves model. So we reference the Graves model all the time. If you're a new listener, if you haven't heard the podcast on the Graves model, please go listen to it, because it's something that we just casually mention all the time. Because it's probably, I think I say this every time I mention it, it's my favorite model, even way more so than Myers-Briggs or any of the other horizontal personality typology systems. The Graves model is definitely my favorite. And the Graves model shows us a progression of developmental worldviews. And one of them, and that one that I'm about to talk about, happens to be the backbone of all civilization as we know it, this level of development, and it happens to be hugely represented in the world even now. And that is what's called World 4, Graves Level 4, in spiral dynamics. It's the, or I think Graves even has it as blue. So this is a worldview in which you identify yourself with a larger community. So your self-identity and the community's identity are almost indistinguishable. Now, you might be like a unique expression of it, and yet you completely identify with this thing. And it can be something as simple as, you're a bank teller and you work in the bank. And so you highly massively identify with the bank, right? Like whatever bank that is. And that's because you are not just you're part of a collective. And Graves level 4 is a very important Graves level to go through for everybody because all the previous Graves levels are way, I mean, they're such a small game. You can barely see outside of yourself and your family unit before Graves level 4. 4 is like the first time you exit a family unit and exit a place where you're just doing things for yourself, and you finally enter a space where you're like, oh, there's a bigger world, right? There's something outside of just me and my family and me just taking what I want. So Graves level 4 is an incredibly important level. It's where we get, again, the backbone of all civilization. It's where all infrastructure comes from. We wouldn't have road systems if we didn't have Graves level 4 because we need people working together as an institution in order to provide these goods and services on a massive scale. So it's not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, because we identify so strongly with these institutions, we end up handing a lot of ourselves over to them. And that includes our belief systems, that includes the way we think about things, and that oftentimes includes our behavior. So what happens a lot of times is when people are ready to graduate from that level, right? And they enter Graves level 5. Now, 5 is similar to 4, only 5s tend to lead 4s. So 5s tend to be like, I kind of think of them as more sophisticated 4s in some extent. They see a bigger context, they see a bit of a bigger world, and they understand how to game that system. Like, I don't just work in the bank. How do I become the manager of the bank? Or how do I get a loan from the bank and start my own business, right? Like, it's a bit of a bigger world, and it's more about capitalizing on what is currently set up in order to get more resource for yourself. And then when people graduate, and they still usually identify pretty strongly with these institutions because the institution is, that's their bread and butter, right? Gaming that institution is their bread and butter, so they have a lot of attachment. It's generally when people graduate from 5 to 6 that you see this big shift happen for them. Because 6 opens up to an even bigger world. And that bigger world starts to question identity associated with an institution. It's now identity with sort of people, right? Like people and just humans and humanity and seeing yourself as part of this bigger human game. So all of a sudden, paradigms and perspectives and memes that were so massively important before, where you massively identified with them, are now they all kind of look the same. Because you're not identifying with paradigms, you're identifying with people. And people have paradigms of a whole rainbow variety. So there's this interesting node in the system called your current Graves level. And your current Graves level is going to impact whether or not you're okay with handing behavior over to other people, right, to an institution, or whether you suddenly become not okay with that anymore. And so it's not even just the memes themselves. Memes are like, they're like people, they're like species, they're like anything else. They just want to live. They want to live, they want to procreate, they want to get to the next level, they don't want to die. And they're kind of okay with adaptation. That can be kind of scary because they don't look the same, but memes usually will adapt over time, and really survival is the important thing for a meme. But people they're the ones that keep those memes going. And as individuals, another node in the system is where are we at in the Graves model? Where are we at in our personal development? And the further along we get, the less we just hand power over to these memes. So if somebody is on the receiving end of being disfellowshipped or shunned or disconnected or whatever it is, it's hard not to get mad at the people doing it. But what's nice about sort of taking this meta perspective of the whole thing is there are a lot of different nodes in the system at work, and the emergent is that you can't have a relationship with your friends and family, and also it's not necessarily specifically a fault, right? Like, it's a system at work, and there's some pretty big nodes in that system, and there's not a lot you can do about that. There's a node where the people who are shunning you are probably Graves level 4 or 5. There's a node in the system that they've aligned themselves very naturally to a paradigm or a belief system or a meme that just wants to live, and this is its strategy for living. And then there's also the piece where, somebody wants to teach you a lesson and they're hoping that pushing you out of the tribe, right? If they force you out of the tribe, you'll see how dire the situation is and you'll have a change of heart and you'll come back. So most of the time when people disconnect from you or shun you, the Amish usually don't allow for a lot of coming back if I after Rumspringa, once you're out, if I'm not mistaken. But most of the institutions allow for some sort of reconciliation. So the desire fundamentally is out of love. The desire is because this person, from their perspective, believes so strongly in this. And a lot of times, if it's a religious situation, they believe that they're doing the right thing for your eternal salvation. And if it's just a political situation, they believe that they're protecting their people. They believe that they're protecting society at large. Like, this is always done with a feeling of love as a general rule. Even if they're like power mongers or whatever, like, I don't know how much love McCarthy actively had during that time period. And yet I do really believe that he was trying to protect society to some extent. So there is always a component of love, even if it looks a little weird. And that's a note in the system too, a desire for reconciliation, a desire for the person in what they believe is the wrong position to have a change of heart and repent and come back. So the situation feels wrong and icky. It can be devastating to the person who's receiving it. And at the same time, the system is very impersonalized. It's not really about your relationship with the people shunning you. It's really about the system that's running. And there's not a lot you can do about it right here, right now. Except, of course, understand that you're not necessarily evil, wrong, horrible, or any of the other things that you might feel because you've been booted from your tribe. And it's really easy to feel those things.
Yeah, that's a good point. As you're talking, so I think in terms these days, in terms of narratives that run in our heads, everything that happens to us. I drive my car home, I park it in a parking lot or driveway, and there's a story around that in my head. Like, that's what's happening, but there's a narrative, like I might be late for an appointment, a coaching call or something I got to get on, or I got to record the podcast today, or whatever the story is in my head that's happening around me just driving up and parking in my driveway is something that I've created, this narrative I've created. And we can see narratives running all the time. You're probably doing something right now as you're listening to me talk that you have a narrative around. Maybe you're on your way to work. You've got a narrative about driving to work to make money for your family. You have a whole story they've created about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And we do this all the time as humans. This is how we get through the world. We use our minds to create stories. This is why stories are so powerful. This is why when you're teaching somebody something, if you can put it into a story or a movie or a documentary, it's so much more powerful than just a straight data set, because our minds love stories. We love to deal with narratives. We love to watch the Star Wars movies and get really immersed in that story. We love stories. So your mind is creating narratives all the time. My mind is creating narratives all the time. That's what we do as humans. And I think what happens when we are involved in these memes, we have stories running. These memes create stories for us that we adopt. We come in line. We align our internal narratives with this bigger narrative, and they're like running side by side. We've got this big narrative of this political system or this religion or this sports team or whatever it is, and we're coming alongside of that. And I think everything's going great. And like you're talking about Graves level 4 and 5, the narratives are running fine. And we also see all of our narratives that we run on a day-to-day basis plugging into a meta-narrative, something that overarches everything. For mine, it was a Judeo-Christian outlook. It was a Judeo-Christian viewpoint. It was about God and country, about the country I lived in, the God I served. It was a meta-narrative over everything else that all my other narratives aligned with. They were part of that bigger narrative. And I think at Graves 6, what happens is you have this awakening moment when you say, oh, wait a minute. I don't think there necessarily is a meta-narrative over all the narratives I've running. These narratives I'm choosing are fairly arbitrary. I'm just picking them at random, and I'm aligning them with some random meta-narrative that I've adopted in my life, whether I was born into it or I've chosen it. And really, there is no ultimate overarching meta-narrative. And as soon as you make that realization, I think from my perspective, that's one of the moments you're moving into Graves 6, or you're starting to think about Graves 6. You're saying, I'm in control of the narratives that are running. I'm in control of the memes that are running in my mind or that I'm a part of. And these are basically just, we pick them as humans to go through them. There's no overarching meta-narrative. And I think once that breaks down for you as a person, you start to see narratives no longer in hierarchical structure, but more horizontal, where it's almost like you're picking one off a shelf. And people call this, postmodern thinking or relativism or whatever. But really, that's what it is. It is relative to whatever situation you're in, the narrative you pull down from that shelf. And I think that when we see new narratives emerging and we're trying to tell stories to ourselves about something new that we're doing and we're moving away from a meme we were a part of, because stories are so powerful, it's just simply hard for us in the first place to be able to really awaken to this idea that we've chosen the story we're living in right now. Like, it feels so immersive. It feels so real to us. It feels so real to me. Every story I'm in, especially if I'm like stressed out or I'm like, moving fast in life, or I'm trying to accomplish something, or I'm really immersed in something, it's hard to see outside of that. And as we go through and we begin to start seeing them for what they are, this is just something I've chosen, we start seeing them everywhere. As soon as you start to extract yourself from a meme that's been a bully to you, and you scale into this idea that, oh, this is just another arbitrary meme or narrative, you start to say, wait a minute, is everything an arbitrary meme or narrative in my life? Like the fact that, literally, like the fact that I walk on two legs, is that just a meme or a narrative I've constructed? Is there an opportunity for me to think about living not walking on two legs? Like, is that something that was trained to me? Is that a narrative I adopted, or is that something that is innate? Everything, the way I eat with a fork and a knife and not my hands at dinner, is that a narrative I've got running? And you start seeing this stuff everywhere as you look. You're like, wow, the fact that I have to have a room lit to walk into it and not just walk into dark rooms, is this a narrative I'm running? And some of that sounds so silly, right? For me to ask those questions. Of course we stand on 2 feet and walk. That's how humans walk. Well, why do we believe that? Again, it seems like we've evolved to do that from a pragmatic standpoint, but there have been studies with kids that were raised, feral, and basically like dogs or wolves were in the pack, and the kids were raised around these wolves, and they were walking on all fours, and they were socialized into a narrative of, this is how I behave. I walk on all fours, because they had not seen humans to give them the other narrative of walking on 2 legs. So if we start seeing this around us everywhere, it's like, wow, this is powerful stuff. And it affects every part of our minds and our lives all the time.
And the stakes are high. The stakes are high with narratives. That's one of the really amazingly unique things about human beings. Like, we've got this big throbbing neocortex with so much ability to construct narratives and stories and have consciousness and self-awareness. And we forget that it's a tool that at some point we just got, right? Like everything feels so real. All the narratives and stories feel so real. And we bank a lot on them. There are certain narratives that we just bank so much on. I think about, talking about a story. Part of the reason why I've been able to personally make peace with having come from what I would call a bully meme and not really having a relationship with my family anymore is that the stakes are too high for my mom to be able to have a relationship with me. So her mother died. My grandmother died actually before I was born. She was only 48 years old, and she died of breast cancer. And my mom was in her 20s, and it just devastated her. It just completely devastated her. And that's when she got really serious about her religion, because she believed that if she was serious about her religion, she'd be able to see her mom again, right? Like, she really hadn't come to terms, or I don't know if she ever really came to terms with her mother's death, right? My grandmother's death. She never really came to terms with that. And then when my sister was 32, my sister died in a tragic epilepsy-related accident. And so then she lost her daughter. So like 2 generations of women flanking her, she lost in death. So she had never really gotten, she'd never really come to terms with my grandmother's death. And now her daughter, which to me it's so much worse to lose your child than a parent, even if your parent dies young. Then my sister dies very young and tragically. And so now she's even more doubled down on this idea that she will see her daughter again. Because, she just couldn't make peace with the fact that she'd lost these 2 people in her lives. So fast forward quite a few years, and now I'm no longer a part of that paradigm. I'm no longer part of the paradigm that says that she'll be able to see her, her mother and her daughter again. And so now I'm the enemy, because I'm threatening her attachment to the narrative that says that she'll be able to see these people again. Now, I can't definitively say she won't. I can't say that my mom's religious beliefs are wrong. I can't say that she'll never, even if her religious beliefs are wrong, maybe another religious belief or spiritual or transcendent belief is true, and she'll totally be able to revisit these 2 people. her mother and her daughter. I don't know. It's just that I won't bank on something I don't know. I just made that choice. I just chose, like, I'm not going to tailor an entire life to a paradigm that I don't know, right? Like if I don't know, I'm not going to take Pascal's wager. There's just too many possible wagers to just settle on one. So I become somebody that she can't talk to, and she has to also, she has to treat me like I'm dead too, because I threaten her ability to see these other two people who have literally died. So now my mom's between a rock and a hard place. Her narrative is so important to her, and she's doubled down so much on this narrative, and it's so, she cannot at this stage in her life come to terms with these deaths that she's never come to terms with. And now, she's pushing 70 at this point. My mom's almost 70 years old. So really, this is the time that she's going to all of a sudden like question her entire life choices. And this is going to be the time period where she's going to go, yeah, well, maybe I just never came to terms with their deaths, and I got to do that now. And then now have a relationship with my other daughter and actually also her son, who has since left the religion of his youth as well, my brother. So my mom's in this terrible predicament, right? She either has a relationship with two children who are threatening her ability to believe that she can see her mother and her other, daughter again, or she chooses to ignore those children and hope that her ignoring them will help them see sense, and then keep the attachment to seeing these other people. So it's a terrible predicament for her. And yet when I fillet it out and see it that way, I have so much compassion for her situation. She is in a horrible, horrible situation. And yeah, I guess she could do something about it, but what a terrible, like she's basically painted herself into a corner at this point. And like you said, these narratives, for me, they feel so arbitrary at this point, right? Like they just really feel like it could be anything. It could be anything that she was raised in and believed in, right? Like, I mean, how many different religions are there, and how many different countries are there to be from, and how many different, like forms of patriotism, and how many different forms of institutions are there? I mean, there's a ton of them. Just name the one that you're into, right? And do I really feel like I need to push that on her at all? And so one of the things that going through the situation for me has done is it helped me understand the concept that, like I named them bully memes. It helped me understand that it's more than just the paradigm, right? It's also our human nature, where we're at in our development, how our brains work, like this idea of like kicking somebody out from the tribe, hoping that helps them see, reason so you can invite them back in. Like there are so many different components to it. So going through the situation really helped me have the ability to flay it out and really understand all these different nodes in the system. But I think one thing that really helped me do is have compassion. It really helped me have compassion for people who are part of paradigms that I don't believe, that I don't personally believe in, because that's human nature. That's what we do. We create narratives and stories, just like you said. That's what we do. That is our unique talent as humans, is to create narratives and stories. And most of our developmental levels encourage us to just assume they're true and real. I think Timothy Leary called them reality tunnels, right? And then later on, I've heard the phrase reality distortion tunnel. These are our reality tunnels. These are the realities that we live in, and we cannot see a periphery beyond them until all of a sudden now we can. And then you look back and we're like, hey, did everybody else wake up too? No? Okay, that's weird. All right, so, now what do I do? Okay, so, like now I'm being booted from the tribe. That's interesting. Right? Like all this stuff happens because we're not sharing each other's narratives, and you go, oh, not sharing each other's narratives is actually why we kill each other. We actually go to war because we don't share each other's narratives. Wow, that makes narratives important and very dangerous, and at the same time powerful. Like they're good, they're bad, they're ugly, they're powerful, but we really have to honor the power of a meme, right? Like we really have to honor that. And we have to ask ourselves, how much of us are we going to hand over to one of them, right? Like how much are we vetting these memes before we hand our character, our behavior, our reality tunnel, right? Like all these things that make up us. How much are we going to hand over to a meme, to a narrative, to a story that just wants to live itself?
If I was listening to this podcast 10 years ago, I would have thought that Joel and Antonia are full of bullshit. I would have been very resistant because I would have sat here and said, you guys, you think you've got it all dialed in. You think you have a bigger perspective. you just really don't see the truth for what it is. You just really don't see the self-evident truth in the world. And, I would cite my religion at the time or my political views at the time. And what I would say to myself now is I would say, Joel, think about, if you think this is so self-evident, if you think this is so true, why does every meme have to have a training or on-ramp program for it? Why does every meme have let's think about an actual structure of patriotism. Why do we have to have kids stand up in a classroom and salute a flag and reinforce a patriotic view of a country or whatever that is? It's because every meme has to have an on-ramp. It has to have a training period of teaching that meme into your psyche, of inputting it. Some are more formal than others. Some you just get by osmosis. Growing up in your family, you might get the idea that, making money is our meme in our family or whatever you might have grown up with. Like money. It's about owning businesses and making money and investing and really achieving. Maybe that's the meme you grew up with, but you still had to learn that meme either through example or training formally or something. And I think that piece, so I would tell myself, Joel, look at the fact that everything has to be trained to do. Doesn't that tell you that it can also be untrained, or that it's something that isn't just self-evident? It isn't just the truth of reality for you. It's something that you had to learn. It's something you had to observe and work into from the time you were born into the time till now. I think that's what I'd tell myself if I looked back 10 years and could sit down and I was listening to this podcast, because I would be extremely resistant to these ideas, like to the point of probably just being like, these guys have no clue what they're talking about. They're full of crap.
Yeah. Oh, me too. Same deal. Well, maybe 10 years ago, I'd been like, that's interesting. But 15, definitely, you guys are full of shit. And what's interesting about this is I think the resistance comes up because, well, these narratives are powerful and we want to cling to them, right? And we feel like we're grafted to our belief systems, whatever they may be, whatever we're identifying with, whatever is a powerful enough reality tunnel. We are grafted to them. We feel like if we lose it, we'll die, right? Like two trees grafted to each other, if you pull them apart at a certain point, that's surgery and it may not survive. And it feels that way. It feels like if we start questioning our narrative, we're grafted to it. We might not survive that one. And so it is scary to do that. And I think, earlier, before we started this podcast, we were talking about what are we going to talk about? We usually do that. Okay, what are we going to talk about? And then we ask, what is the point, right? Like, where are we trying to guide the conversation toward? And I had a moment of realization that, as far as I'm concerned, for the Personality Hacker podcast, all roads lead to empowerment and permission, right? Like, as far as I'm concerned, like every single podcast, the point fundamentally is personal empowerment and permission.
I agree.
So it's not the message isn't leave your reality tunnel. It's not assume that your country is the worst country all of a sudden, right? And it's not to look at your political persuasion and hop on the other side, right? It's if you're conservative, it's not to talk you into being a liberal. If you're a liberal, it's not to talk you into being a conservative, right? If you're of a certain religious paradigm or persuasion, it's not to talk you out of that. It's to make sure that every decision you're making is thoughtful, mindful, and comes from a place of empowerment, right? And self-permission. If you feel empowered to question your narrative, if you feel permission to leave it if you want to, if you feel like you are at a place where you are at the best version of yourself, then you are exactly where you need to be. However, most of us aren't. Even if we think we are, most of us are not. We're not actually at a place of empowerment. We're not actually at a place of permission. So probably I would say, if somebody really pinned me on it, what is the point of the podcast? Those two things are the point. Personality typology, all the typology models that we do. What is the point of them? Figure out who you are so you can become the best version. Give yourself permission to be yourself and give yourself empowerment. And that's the point of everything. So these conversations can feel subversive. They can feel like we're trying to insinuate. I mean, you're sitting here with us. I don't know what your persuasions are. I don't know if you're part of an ashram community. I don't know if you're a liberal. I don't know if you're, an Oakland Raiders fan or the worst case scenario is, of course, a Patriots fan, but but that's my reality tunnel. But whatever it is, like, I don't know what your persuasions are. I have no idea what your personal context is. And yet, are you sure that you're realizing that it's a reality tunnel? It's a narrative, and it might be true. That's the crazy thing about these narratives, is that actually might be true, and yet they might not, right? And they can be arbitrary. So if you feel empowered to look at your narrative and go, this is a reality tunnel, and I'm choosing it. If you feel permission to go, I can leave at any time, and I know that sometimes leaving will mean walking away with a mushroom cloud behind me and like my silhouette against that mushroom cloud, and yet I feel full permission to do that, and yet I choose to stay, or vice versa. I've already done that with a previous incarnation of my life, and now I'm in another place that I fully chose. That's the point, right? That's the point. It's not meant to be subversive. It's meant to be empowering.
Yeah, and if you're a first-time listener, if you've never listened to us before, one of the things that helped me in my extraction process from all these meta-narratives and all these memes that I felt were in control of my life rather than me in control. And I still obviously have memes and narratives running, and we all still have them. It's just I feel much more empowered to be the chooser of those. And I think what helped me is something that we do a lot here on this podcast. So I'd invite you to go back and listen to a lot of the old episodes if you haven't yet, because we talk about frameworks and models that will help you make sense of some of the new ways you might want to be thinking. So if you are ready, and I think this is what I would also tell myself 10 years ago, because like you, I probably would have rejected it, but I would have been interested, especially if the person telling me had frameworks and models for me to understand what they were saying better. I would have been very interested. And so I think what you can gain from listening to the podcast, if you go back and you subscribe and you listen through all of them, is we introduce a lot of frameworks and models that you can use in your personal development journey. You know, we're called Personality Hacker. We really do center on understanding who you are. And then we introduce a lot of these other frameworks like the Graves model. And we talk about how you can look at these in your life and begin to construct the life that you actually want to move forward with. And it's not like a rah-rah session of, you can do it, we believe in you. I mean, we do believe in you, and we think you have the intelligence and the aptitude and the desire, most likely because you're listening here and you're interested in personal growth. So you probably have the gumption for it. It's not a rah-rah session, though. They're actual tools, actual frameworks, actual things you can use. So I encourage you to go back and listen to some of those things, because as you're beginning to think in these terms, I think models and frameworks are extremely powerful for you to be introducing more plasticity to the way you think about the narratives running in your life and the way you think about these memes that may become bullies for you. And that plasticity can come from a tool set that you can gain by listening back through some of the frameworks we talk about, and other places too that have some of these frameworks.
And full disclosure, all the models are narratives. They're all memes of their own. Like, you can't really communicate without memeing. Like, the fact that we're using language, I'm assuming that you're listening because you understand the English language. The English language is, like, each word in and of itself is a narrative, right? Like, they're all narratives and stories. That's the point of communication. So every model that we have is a narrative. However, it's one that you can hold loosely. You don't have to cling too tight to it. It doesn't have to be how you identify yourself or see yourself. I'm not a person, I don't identify myself as somebody who believes in the Graves model. I see the Graves model as a tool that I can utilize, and then if it no longer serves me, I don't have to use it. So it is a narrative, it's a meme, but it's not a bully. It doesn't require my unconditional love. It doesn't require my exclusive devotion to it.
You know, it's so weird as you say that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we were watching that movie last night, Going Clear. When people were coming into the Scientology religion, that's what they would tell them. They would say the exact same thing you just said. Yeah. They would say, hey, by the way, this may not be reality. Don't buy this too much. You're still making your own decisions. Don't turn yourself over to something else beyond yourself. Make sure you're still in control of all this. And yet, I think it did pull people in, or at least some people in, for not thinking for themselves in that way. So it's interesting to think that even that is something that people that are part of bully memes might tell you. In fact, that's what I thought. I mean, when I was in a meme in my life, I thought, oh, I'm making decisions for myself. I chose this, and this is really where, and I still tell myself that, and maybe someday I'll realize that I was deceiving myself now as much as I was then. It starts getting really meta, Hall of Mirrors like, right? It goes back, like way back to infinity on this kind of stuff.
Well, and maybe we'll do a podcast episode on talking about the Hall of Mirrors, because it does fundamentally get to that place. Well, we've Joel and I have both done work around like ego transcendence work, where we talk about the watcher, the thing that watches our ego. And the ego is how you identify yourself. That's the I. So my ego is named Antonia. And Antonia does all sorts of interesting things. And I can watch Antonia do stuff, but who's the person watching if it's not Antonia? So maybe we'll do a podcast on that because that's actually a really intriguing topic. That said, yeah, it was funny because when I was watching Going Clear last night, not only did they say the same thing that we say all the time, which is don't hold too tightly to anything, which was fascinating. They were also using NLP techniques, which is something that you and I use, neuro-linguistic programming techniques. And that was so interesting to me that they were using like some kind of standard NLP techniques early on. But I don't think they had integrity to their message of you don't have to hold too tightly to it. If you watch the movie Going Clear, again, it's only one side of the story. And yet it doesn't seem like they're totally okay if you let go of that set of tools. Whereas what I like about typology and models of development and maps, there's nobody really policing that. There's nobody enforcing it. So I do recommend heading that direction if you are at a position right now where you're feeling a need for some more empowerment and permission. Go the direction of maps and models. That seemed to be the thing that helped us sort of navigate our way out of that train. That was our map and flashlight to get out of the places that we were at and the dark spaces. And it actually has helped quite a bit. So
yeah, what narratives do you have running? I'm curious to hear. I'm sure Antonia is as well. Come over to personalityhacker.com, and underneath this podcast, there's a comment section where you can enter a comment. You can't talk with us on a microphone right now, but you can come over and leave a comment underneath this podcast, and we can have a conversation. We can have a dialogue about these narratives, about bully memes, about the narratives maybe you've graduated from or incorporated in your life, or the way you think about this. I'd really love to hear how you are thinking about this specific topic. And again, come over to personalityhacker.com and leave your feedback under this podcast.
If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And we would love to hear your feedback, not only in the comment section, but also on iTunes. Please feel free to leave a rating and review.
And if you subscribe, you can go back and listen to all the podcasts, like I said earlier. And we'd love for you to introduce us to somebody that would like to hear this every week, be a part of this conversation and, this community. If you know a friend or a family member that you think would really resonate or identify or really enjoy being a part of this conversation with you and us each week, we'd love to have an introduction to someone in your life that you think this would be powerful for. You can find us at facebook.com/personalityhacker. Also twitter.com/personalityhack. Both of those places, we have a growing community of like minds, people just like you who are interested in personal growth and really understanding how to use models and frameworks and actual tool sets to grow in their lives. So both those places are great places to come. And of course, if you come over to personalityhacker.com and you haven't taken our personality test, you can come do that as well. And we'd love to have you come through there. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Can't wait to have you part of the conversation on the next Personality Hacker podcast.